It is just before dawn on the Mediterranean coast. The year is 48 BC, and you are standing on the great harbor of Alexandria, watching the first pale light touch the top of the tallest structure ever built by human hands. The Pharos Lighthouse rises behind you, its mirror catching the sun's earliest rays, preparing to guide ships that will arrive from every corner of the known world. The air is cool and smells of salt and smoke from the brazier that burns eternal at the lighthouse's summit. There is also the scent of fish from the night's catch being unloaded at the docks, mingling with the perfume of spices from merchant vessels anchored in the deeper water. The stone beneath your feet is damp with morning dew, and you can hear the gentle lap of waves against the harbor walls, a sound that has remained constant for 3 centuries. In the distance, beyond the royal palace and the museum complex, you can hear the first stirrings of a city unlike any other on earth. The call to prayer from a Jewish synagogue mingles with the chants from an Egyptian temple. Greek merchants are already opening their shops along the Canopic Way. Somewhere in the darkness, a philosopher is still awake, bent over a scroll by lamplight, his eyes straining to read one more passage before the sun rises. This is Alexandria, the greatest city of the ancient world, the place where all human knowledge was meant to be gathered and preserved forever. This is the city that dared to collect every book, every scroll, every whisper of wisdom from every culture it could reach. This is a place where Greek reason met Egyptian mysticism, where Jewish scripture was translated for the first time, where the size of the earth was calculated, where human bodies were opened to reveal their secrets. And this is the city that would burn, slowly, across centuries, until almost nothing remained but memory and loss. Tonight we will walk through the streets of a metropolis that no longer exists. We will enter the legendary Library of Alexandria, not as distant observers, but as participants in its daily life. We will meet the scholars who measured the circumference of the earth, who mapped the stars, who dissected human bodies to understand the mysteries of life. We will feel the weight of a papyrus scroll in our hands, smell the lamp oil burning in the copying rooms, hear the arguments of philosophers in marble courtyards. We will witness the slow, tragic unraveling of the greatest repository of human knowledge ever assembled. This is not simply a story about books. It is a story about what happens when civilizations collide, when religions war over the soul of a city, when knowledge itself becomes dangerous. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. So now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time when a single city held the memory of the entire human race within its walls. The story of Alexandria begins not with buildings or books, but with a young man who believed he could change the world. His name was Alexander, and by the age of 32, he had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India. In the year 331 BC, during his campaign against the Persian Empire, he arrived at the western edge of the Nile Delta. Here on a thin strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Moeotis, he saw something that others had missed. He saw the perfect place for a city. The location was brilliant in its geography. The strip of land was protected from the desert by the lake, and from the sea by a natural island called Pharos. The harbor could shelter the largest fleets. The climate was mild, cooled by Mediterranean breezes that made the brutal Egyptian heat bearable. Most importantly, it stood at the crossroads of 3 continents. Ships from Greece and Rome could sail here from the north. Caravans from Africa could arrive from the south, bringing ivory and gold and exotic animals, and the great trade routes from Asia bringing silk and spices and precious stones could flow through Egypt to reach this port. Alexander understood that whoever controlled this point controlled the flow of goods and ideas between East and West. He began to plan the city in his mind, sketching its outline in the sand with his spear. Legend says that when Alexander traced the outline of his city, he used barley meal because no chalk was available. Birds descended and ate the grain, which was interpreted by his seers as a bad omen, suggesting the city would be consumed. But other advisors argued it meant the opposite, that the city would feed the world. Alexander chose to believe the optimistic interpretation. He would not live to know which prophecy proved true. Within a year of founding Alexandria, he marched eastward again, chasing the remains of the Persian army deep into Central Asia and then down into India. Within 11 years, he was dead, struck down by fever in Babylon at the age of 33, his vast empire fragmenting among his generals. But the seed he planted on that Egyptian shore would grow into something far more enduring than any military conquest. The task of actually building Alexandria fell to one of Alexander's most trusted companions, a general named Ptolemy. When Alexander died and his empire was divided among his commanders in a series of brutal wars, Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his prize. He was clever enough to understand that Egypt, with its ancient wealth and natural defenses, was more valuable than the scattered territories his rivals fought over. He declared himself pharaoh, beginning a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries, and he understood that to hold this wealthy kingdom, to make it secure against his rivals, he needed a capital worthy of Alexander's vision. He needed a city that would be the envy of the world. Ptolemy hired the finest architects and urban planners of the age. The most famous was Dissected of Rhodes, the same man who had helped Alexander lay out the original plan. They designed Alexandria according to the most advanced principles of Greek city planning, principles that had been refined over generations of building new colonies around the Mediterranean. The city would be laid out in a perfect grid, with broad, straight streets intersecting at right angles. This was revolutionary. Most ancient cities had grown organically over centuries, their streets winding and narrow, following old paths and the natural contours of the land. Alexandria was different. It was a city designed from nothing, a rational, ordered creation that reflected the Greek belief in geometry and proportion, in the power of human reason to impose order on chaos. The main avenue, the Canopic Way, was said to be wide enough for 6 chariots to ride side by side. It stretched for miles, running east to west through the heart of the city, connecting the Gate of the Sun in the east to the Gate of the Moon in the west. Colonnades lined both sides, providing shade from the brutal Mediterranean sun during the day and shelter from the occasional winter rains. The columns were carved from limestone and marble, some plain and functional, others elaborately decorated with acanthus leaves and geometric patterns. Shops and workshops filled the ground floors of buildings, their goods spilling out onto the colonnade, creating a continuous marketplace. Wealthy families lived in apartments above, their windows looking down on the constant flow of humanity below. At night, oil lamps mounted on posts lit the major streets, another innovation that made Alexandria famous. Most cities of the ancient world were dark and dangerous after sunset, ruled by thieves and wild dogs. Alexandria glowed. The population grew with astonishing speed. Greeks arrived first, soldiers and merchants and craftsmen seeking fortune in this new metropolis. They brought their language, their gods, their love of theater and philosophy. They were followed by Egyptians from the Nile Valley, drawn by the promise of work building the new capital. They came from ancient cities like Memphis and Thebes, bringing with them thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about agriculture, architecture, and the rhythms of the Nile. Jewish communities established themselves early, fleeing persecution or seeking economic opportunity. They brought their monotheism, their sacred texts, their networks of trade that stretched across the Mediterranean. Within a generation, Alexandria had become the 2nd largest city in the world, surpassed only by Rome itself. At its peak, it may have held 500,000 people, an almost unimaginable concentration of humanity for the ancient world, all packed onto that narrow strip of land between lake and sea. But Ptolemy's ambitions went beyond commerce and population. He wanted to create something unprecedented, something that would make his city immortal. He wanted to make Alexandria not just a center of trade, but the center of human knowledge. This was partly practical. A great city needed great institutions to attract the wealthy and educated, the poets and philosophers whose presence would bring prestige. But it was also ideological. The Greeks believed that knowledge itself was sacred, that the pursuit of wisdom was the highest calling of human life, more noble than warfare or politics, or the accumulation of wealth. Ptolemy, who had spent his youth listening to Aristotle lecture at the Macedonian court, understood this. He decided to build a place where scholars from every nation could gather to study, to teach, to preserve and create knowledge. He decided to build the Library of Alexandria. The decision to create the library was announced within years of the city's founding. The location chosen was in the royal quarter, near the palace itself, overlooking the great harbor. This was a deliberate statement of how important this institution would be. It would not be tucked away in some forgotten corner, but placed at the very heart of power. But the library, as we often imagine it, a single building filled with shelves, was not what Ptolemy built. It was something far more complex and ambitious. The proper name was the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, the 9 divine sisters who inspired all arts and sciences. It was a research institute, a university, a museum, and a library, all combined into one sprawling complex of buildings and gardens. It was closer to a modern university campus than to a simple library. Construction began under Ptolemy I, but was completed by his son Ptolemy II, who inherited both the throne and his father's obsession with knowledge. Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, meaning brother-loving, was even more ambitious than his father. Under his rule, the complex grew to include lecture halls where philosophers could debate, laboratories equipped with the finest instruments available, observatories with star charts and astronomical tools, dissection rooms where physicians could study anatomy, botanical gardens filled with plants from across the empire, and even a zoo filled with exotic animals brought from Africa and India. Scholars could study living elephants and observe their behavior, could examine the teeth of crocodiles, could watch monkeys and compare their anatomy to humans. At the center of all this was the library proper, a massive columned building housing reading rooms and storage chambers for hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Attached to this was a smaller library, called the Serapeum, located in the Temple of Serapis in another part of the city, serving as both overflow storage and a public branch where ordinary citizens could access knowledge. Imagine walking through the entrance for the first time. You approach from the harbor, passing through the royal quarter with its gleaming marble facades. The Mouseion complex rises before you, a series of interconnected buildings arranged around courtyards and gardens. You pass through a great portico, columns of marble rising on either side, each one 20 feet tall, carved with inscriptions honoring the muses. The floor is polished stone, cool beneath your sandaled feet, even in the heat of midday. The air inside is noticeably different from the street outside, cooler and drier, carefully controlled to preserve the precious scrolls. The architects have designed the building to maximize airflow while minimizing direct sunlight, which would fade the ink and damage the papyrus. As your eyes adjust to the dimmer light, filtered through high windows covered with thin alabaster sheets, you see them. Shelf after shelf, niche after niche, thousands upon thousands of scrolls, each one rolled and tied with colored cord, labeled with tags identifying the title and author, organized by subject and author. This is not simply a collection of books. This is the memory of the world, gathered in one place for the first time in human history. The scholars who lived and worked at the Mouseion were not ordinary men. They were the most brilliant minds of their age, invited by the Ptolemies and given royal stipends to pursue their research. They were exempt from taxes. They received free room and board. They dined at the king's table, literally, sharing meals in a common dining hall but eating food prepared in the royal kitchens. They had access to resources no other scholars in the world could dream of. The finest instruments, unlimited papyrus for their own writings, assistants to help with calculations or experiments, and most importantly, time to think, to study, to pursue ideas wherever they led. In return, they were expected to teach, to write, to advance human knowledge. Some specialized in mathematics or astronomy, others focused on medicine or geography. Still others devoted themselves to literature, grammar, and poetry. They came from every corner of the Greek-speaking world and beyond. Some were Greeks from Athens or Sparta or the islands. Others were Jews who wrote in Greek, participating fully in Hellenistic intellectual life. Some were Egyptians who had adopted Greek language and culture while maintaining their connection to ancient Egyptian traditions. They formed a community bound not by blood or nation, but by shared curiosity, by the belief that understanding the world was the most important task a human being could undertake. Life as a scholar at the Mouseion followed a particular rhythm, shaped by the Mediterranean climate and the demands of intellectual work. Your day would begin early, with a simple breakfast of bread, olive oil and wine mixed with water. The wine was weak, meant more for safe hydration than intoxication. You would then make your way to the library itself, walking through gardens where exotic plants grew, their flowers filling the morning air with unfamiliar scents. You would pass the zoo, hearing the calls of birds from distant lands, perhaps stopping to observe an elephant or giraffe, creatures that seemed to embody the reach of the empire that supported your work. At the library entrance, you could request specific scrolls from the librarians who managed the collection. These men were not simply custodians. They were scholars themselves, experts in bibliography and textual criticism who could guide you to sources, suggest connections between texts, help you navigate the vast sea of information contained within these walls. The head librarian was one of the most prestigious positions in the ancient world, held by men whose names are still remembered: Xenodotus, Callimachus, Eratosthenes, Aristarchus, scholars who shaped how knowledge was organized and preserved. You might spend the morning reading, making notes on wax tablets or scraps of papyrus that you could later copy into more permanent form. The reading rooms were designed for scholarship, with benches and tables positioned to catch natural light from high windows. The light came from the north, preferred because it was steady throughout the day, without the harsh glare and movement of direct sunlight. The air was deliberately kept dry, with good ventilation to prevent mold and decay from damaging the papyrus. Braziers provided warmth in winter, but they were carefully managed to avoid any risk of fire. The smell of the library was distinctive, a mixture of old papyrus, lamp oil, and the particular mustiness that comes from rooms filled with ancient documents. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of knowledge accumulated. At midday you would break for a communal meal in the dining hall. This was not a quick, functional affair. It was a symposium in the original sense, a coming together for food and conversation. Here, surrounded by fellow scholars, the conversation would turn to ideas. Someone might describe a new observation they had made of the stars, claiming to have detected a pattern in planetary motion. Another might pose a mathematical problem they were struggling to solve, asking if anyone had encountered similar issues. Arguments would erupt over points of philosophy, whether the soul was immortal, whether the gods intervened in human affairs, whether true knowledge was possible, or whether we lived in a world of illusions and shadows. These debates could become heated, with scholars from different schools of thought defending their positions with passion. But there were rules of engagement, inherited from generations of Greek philosophical tradition. You argued with evidence and logic, not with authority or force. The goal was truth, not victory. After the meal, some scholars would return to their studies. Others might walk in the gardens, discussing their work with colleagues in the dappled shade of trees brought from across the known world. Some would teach, delivering lectures to students who had come to Alexandria specifically to learn from the masters. The afternoon was often devoted to writing, to the slow work of composing treatises that would join the collection in the library, adding to the sum of human knowledge. But the library's existence raised a crucial question. How do you build the world's greatest collection of knowledge? The answer, as it turned out, was through a combination of aggressive acquisition, careful copying, and sometimes outright theft. The Ptolemies were obsessed with expanding the library's holdings. They understood that knowledge was power, that a comprehensive library was both a tool of scholarship and a statement of imperial might. They issued a decree that became famous, or infamous, throughout the Mediterranean world. Any ship arriving in Alexandria's harbor must declare any books on board. These would be confiscated, taken to the library, copied by professional scribes, and the copies would be returned to the owners while the originals remained in Alexandria, filed in a special section called From the Ships. You can imagine the outrage of a merchant who arrived with a rare manuscript, perhaps a family heirloom or a text he was transporting for a patron in Rome, only to receive back a fresh copy, beautifully made but lacking the authority and provenance of the original, while his valuable document disappeared into the royal library, added to the collection without compensation. The Ptolemies sent agents throughout the Mediterranean world with bags of gold, instructed to purchase any significant texts they could find. These agents were given generous budgets and clear instructions. Price was no object. If a rare text was available, buy it. If the owner refused to sell, offer more. If they still refused, use persuasion, bribery, or if necessary, find other methods. They were willing to pay enormous sums for rare works. When Athens possessed the official state copies of the great tragedies, the definitive texts of plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, Ptolemy III asked to borrow them so they could be copied for the library. The Athenians were understandably reluctant. These were their cultural treasures, the authentic versions of their greatest literary works. But Ptolemy offered a guarantee, depositing 15 talents of silver as collateral, an enormous fortune, enough to build a fleet of warships. The Athenians, reassured by this massive deposit, sent the precious scrolls to Alexandria. But Ptolemy never returned them. He forfeited the silver, kept the originals, and sent back beautifully made copies. The loss of 15 talents meant nothing compared to possessing the authentic texts of the great tragedians. This story, recorded by multiple ancient sources, became famous as an example of both the Ptolemies' commitment to their library and their willingness to use any means necessary to expand it. This hunger for books was not merely about prestige, though prestige was certainly part of it. The scholars at the Mouseion understood something profound about the nature of knowledge. They understood that knowledge is fragile. Texts exist in multiple versions, corrupted over time by copying errors, altered by well-meaning editors who improve the text, or simply lost when the only copy burns or rots away or is destroyed in war. By gathering as many versions as possible, by comparing them side by side, scholars could reconstruct original texts, identify errors that had crept in over generations of copying, and preserve knowledge that might otherwise vanish. This was the birth of textual criticism, the careful scholarly practice of comparing manuscripts to establish authentic versions of ancient works. Without Alexandria's obsessive collecting, many works of Greek literature and philosophy would have been lost forever, or survived only in corrupt versions that obscured the original author's meaning. The copying rooms of the library were workshops of preservation, factories of knowledge production. Imagine a long hall, its walls lined with niches for storage, its center filled with dozens of scribes sitting at high desks, each one hunched over a scroll, carefully reproducing the text before them. The light comes from windows high in the walls, and from oil lamps on each desk, though the lamps are used sparingly because of the fire risk. The room is filled with the sound of reed pens scratching on papyrus, a gentle susurrus that never stops during working hours. These were not ordinary copyists. They were trained professionals, many of them slaves, but some free men who had made this their craft, who took pride in their work and understood its importance. They wrote in a clear, practiced hand, using reed pens cut from the papyrus plant itself, the tip shaped to create the specific width of line required. The pens were dipped in carbon-based ink, made from soot mixed with water and gum arabic to make it sticky. The papyrus itself was made from the papyrus plant that grew in abundance along the Nile. The stems were cut, the pith extracted, sliced into thin strips, laid in perpendicular layers and pressed together. The natural sugars in the plant acted as glue. The resulting sheet, once dried, provided a smooth, durable surface for writing. Individual sheets were glued together to create long rolls, typically about 30 feet long, though some could be much longer. Each scroll represented hours, sometimes days of labor. A scribe had to maintain perfect concentration. A single error could propagate through future copies, corrupting the text forever, sending false information cascading down through centuries. The work was exhausting. Ancient sources describe scribes developing eye strain, back pain, and hand cramps from the repetitive work. But it was also considered honorable work, essential work. These men knew they were fighting against time and chaos, preserving the words of Homer and Euripides and Plato for future generations. When a scroll was completed, it would be checked by a more senior scholar, compared line by line against the original, and corrected if necessary. Only then would it be added to the library's collection, carefully labeled with the title, author, and sometimes notes about where it had been acquired, who had owned it previously, or which version it represented if multiple versions of a text existed. The scrolls were stored in cylindrical containers made of leather or wood, or laid flat in wooden cabinets, organized by subject. The library maintained detailed catalogues, the first true library catalogues in history, allowing scholars to locate specific works within the vast collection. The most famous catalogue was created by Callimachus, a poet and scholar who served as head librarian. His catalogue, called the Pinax, or tables, ran to 120 volumes and listed every work in the library, organized by category and author. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a comprehensive database, and it set the standard for how libraries would organize knowledge for centuries to come. But the Mouseion was more than a library. It was an active center of scientific research, and nowhere was this more visible than in its astronomical observatory. The roof of one of the main buildings had been converted into an observation platform, accessible by a narrow staircase that spiraled up through the building. Here scholars could stand under the open sky, far above the light and noise of the city, and observe the heavens. The platform was equipped with the finest instruments of the age, armillary spheres, constructed of bronze rings representing the celestial equator and ecliptic, allowed astronomers to measure the positions of stars and planets with unprecedented accuracy. Sundials and water clocks allowed precise measurement of time. Star charts carefully drawn on papyrus or inscribed on bronze tablets recorded the positions of hundreds of stars. The Greeks had inherited astronomical knowledge from the Babylonians and Egyptians, civilizations that had been observing the heavens for thousands of years. But they sought to go further. They wanted not just to record what they saw, but to explain why the heavens moved as they did, to find the underlying mathematical principles that governed the cosmos. One of the most famous scholars to work at Alexandria was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as head librarian in the 3rd century BC. Eratosthenes was a polymath, brilliant in multiple fields, known for his work in mathematics, astronomy, geography, and poetry. His colleagues nicknamed him Beta, meaning second, because while he was excellent in many fields, he was supposedly not the absolute best in any one area. But his most astonishing achievement was calculating the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, over 1700 years before anyone sailed around it. He did this through observation and geometry, using nothing more sophisticated than sticks and shadows and careful measurement. He knew, from reports, that at noon on the summer solstice, in the city of Syene far south in Egypt, the sun stood directly overhead. At that exact moment, the sun would shine straight down into a deep well, illuminating the bottom, and a vertical post would cast no shadow. But in Alexandria, at the same moment, a vertical post cast a shadow at a measurable angle. Eratosthenes measured this angle carefully. It was approximately 7 degrees, about 1/50th of a circle. He knew the distance between Alexandria and Syene, approximately 5,000 stadia, a measurement he obtained from royal surveyors who had paced out the distance. If 7 degrees corresponded to 5,000 stadia, then the full circle of the Earth's circumference must be 50 times that, or 250,000 stadia. Converting ancient stadia to modern measurements is uncertain, but most scholars believe Eratosthenes' result was within 15% of the true value, an extraordinary achievement given the tools available. He proved, through pure reason and simple observation, that the Earth was a sphere and calculated its size. This knowledge would be forgotten in the European Middle Ages and would have to be rediscovered, but in Alexandria, in the 3rd century BC, it was simply one achievement among many in a city devoted to understanding the world. Another scholar, Aristarchus of Samos, proposed something even more radical, something that would not be accepted for 18 centuries. He suggested that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but instead revolved around the sun. This heliocentric model contradicted all common sense and observation. After all, we do not feel the Earth moving beneath our feet. The sun appears to rise in the east and set in the west. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. Everything visible suggests that we stand still while the heavens move around us. But Aristarchus, through mathematical reasoning and observation, concluded that this appearance was deceiving. He calculated the relative sizes and distances of the sun and moon, getting many details wrong but grasping the essential truth that the sun was vastly larger than the Earth. It made more sense, he argued, for the smaller body to orbit the larger. The idea was too revolutionary, too contrary to both philosophical tradition and everyday experience. Aristotle had taught that the Earth was the center of the cosmos, that the celestial bodies were made of a perfect unchanging fifth element that moved in perfect circles around us. This was not just science. It was metaphysics, a complete worldview that placed humanity at the center of creation. Aristarchus's heliocentric model was rejected, dismissed as absurd, contrary to physics and common sense. It would not be seriously reconsidered until Copernicus, 18 centuries later, proposed the same idea and faced similar resistance. But the fact that such an idea could even be proposed, argued in public lectures, written down and preserved, demonstrates the intellectual freedom that existed within Alexandria's walls. No idea was too radical to be discussed. No traditional belief was beyond questioning. This was the spirit of the Mouseion, the belief that truth could be found through reason and observation, that human minds were capable of understanding the cosmos. Medicine, too, flourished in Alexandria in ways impossible anywhere else in the ancient world. The Ptolemies, perhaps because they were Greek rulers of an Egyptian population and less bound by Greek religious taboos, perhaps because they valued knowledge above tradition, permitted something that was forbidden in most of the Greek world. They allowed the dissection of human corpses. In most Greek cities, this would have been unthinkable, a violation of sacred law, an insult to the gods and to the dead. The body was sacred, and to cut it open was to commit a terrible transgression. But in Alexandria, the pursuit of knowledge took precedence. Two physicians, Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Ceos, pioneered the systematic study of human anatomy through dissection. They opened bodies and examined them carefully, describing what they found in meticulous detail, sketching diagrams, comparing the structures of different organs, attempting to understand how the human body functioned. Herophilus was particularly interested in the brain and nervous system. He performed dissections of the human brain, carefully peeling back the skull and the protective membranes beneath, exposing the gray and white matter within. He concluded, through observation and reasoning, that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence and consciousness. This contradicted Aristotle, the great philosopher whose works were studied throughout the Greek world, who had taught that the heart was the organ of thought, and that the brain merely served to cool the blood. But Herophilus trusted his observations over authority. He could see that the brain was connected to the sense organs through nerves. He traced these nerves, following them from eyes and ears and nose back to the brain. He distinguished between sensory nerves and motor nerves, understanding that some carried information inward while others carried commands outward. He also studied the circulatory system, distinguishing between arteries and veins, observing that arteries pulse while veins do not. He measured pulse rates using a water clock, one of the first attempts to quantify medical observation, to turn the art of medicine into something resembling a science. Erasistratus went further, proposing detailed theories about how the body functioned. He believed that nerves transmitted sensation through pneuma, a vital spirit or breath that flowed through hollow tubes. He proposed theories about how muscles contracted, how food was digested, how blood moved through the body. Many of his conclusions were wrong. He believed, for instance, that arteries carried air rather than blood, a mistake that would persist for centuries. But the method was revolutionary. He was attempting to understand the body through direct observation rather than philosophical speculation, to base medical knowledge on evidence rather than theory. The anatomical knowledge gained through these dissections advanced medicine for centuries. Greek and Roman physicians, working without the ability to perform their own dissections, relied on the descriptions written by Herophilus and Erasistratus, using their diagrams to understand the internal structure of the human body. But there are darker stories too, rumors that have echoed through history but remain unproven and deeply controversial. Some ancient sources, writing centuries after the fact, claim that the Ptolemies provided Herophilus and Erasistratus not only with the corpses of the dead, but with living criminals, prisoners condemned to death, so that they could observe the functions of living organs, watch the beating of a living heart, see how breath moved through living lungs. These accounts describe vivisection, the dissection of living human beings, a horror that would make these physicians among history's most monstrous figures, practitioners of torture in the name of knowledge. The Roman writer Celsus, writing 3 centuries later, claims that the physicians vivisected hundreds of criminals, studying their bodies while they were still alive and conscious. Other sources dispute this, arguing that the stories were invented by later writers hostile to Alexandria, to Greek medicine, or to the pursuit of anatomical knowledge in general. Modern scholars debate whether these stories are true or were propaganda. The truth may never be known. The original writings of Herophilus and Erasistratus are lost, destroyed when the library burned, and we have only later summaries and references. What is certain is that the anatomical knowledge gained in Alexandria, however it was obtained, advanced medicine for centuries, and that this knowledge came at a cost, whether in the violation of the dead or possibly the torture of the living. While scholars dissected bodies and measured the stars, while they catalogued the library's ever-growing collection and debated philosophy in marble courtyards, another wonder of Alexandria drew the eyes of every sailor and traveler who approached the city by sea. The Pharos Lighthouse stood on the island of the same name, connected to the city by a long causeway called the Heptastadion, meaning 7 stades in length, roughly 3/4 of a mile. The causeway was wide enough for chariots and carts, and it effectively created 2 harbors, one to the east and one to the west, doubling the city's capacity for maritime commerce. The lighthouse was not merely functional, a tool for navigation. It was a statement, a declaration that Alexandria was a city of marvels, a place where human ingenuity could rival the works of nature herself. Construction began under Ptolemy, and was completed under Ptolemy II, around 280 BC. The project took approximately 20 years and required enormous resources. The architect was Sostratus of Cnidus, a Greek engineer and merchant, whose name was inscribed on the building, though legend says he hid it beneath a layer of plaster, bearing the pharaoh's name, knowing that the plaster would eventually fall away, revealing his own credit to posterity. Whether this story is true or not, it captures something about the pride and ambition of the builders, their sense that they were creating something that would endure. The lighthouse rose in 3 stages, each one narrower than the one below, creating a stepped profile that could be seen from miles away. The base was square, built of massive limestone blocks, some weighing 70 tons, quarried from the desert and transported to the island. The base was over 200 feet tall and housed workshops where artisans maintained the lighthouse mechanisms, storage rooms for fuel, quarters for the garrison that guarded the structure, and stables for the donkeys that hauled fuel up the long internal ramp. Above this rose an octagonal middle section, another 100 feet tall, its 8 sides providing a gradual transition from square to circular. And above that, a circular top crowned with a statue, perhaps of Zeus or Poseidon, or Helios the sun god, watching over the sea, blessing and protecting the sailors who depended on the lighthouse for their safety. The total height is uncertain. Ancient sources disagree, exaggerating as ancient sources often did, but most modern estimates place it somewhere between 380 and 450 feet tall, taller than any other building in the ancient world except the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its summit burned a great fire, fed day and night, and behind this fire stood an enormous bronze mirror, polished to perfection by artisans who had learned the craft of mirror making from Egyptian smiths. The mirror reflected and focused the firelight out to sea, creating a beam that could guide ships through the dangerous approach to the harbor. Ancient writers claimed the light could be seen from 30 miles away, guiding ships safely home. Some claimed even more, that the mirror could focus sunlight during the day to set enemy ships on fire, though this seems to be legend rather than fact. Whether the most extreme claims are exaggeration or truth is impossible to say, but certainly no other lighthouse of the age came close to its power or its fame. Inside the lighthouse, a long ramp spiraled upward, wide enough for donkeys to climb, carrying fuel for the eternal flame. The fuel was wood during the early centuries, later supplemented with oil as forests became depleted, and shipping brought more olive oil to Egypt. Imagine the life of a keeper assigned to this structure. Your days would be spent hauling wood or oil up that endless ramp, your legs burning with effort, your back bent under the weight. The ramp spirals up through the dim interior, lit only by small windows and occasional oil lamps. You pass storage rooms stacked with fuel, guard rooms where soldiers play dice to pass the time, workshops where craftsmen repair equipment. Finally, after what feels like hours of climbing, you emerge into the circular chamber at the top. Here the fire burns, fed constantly, never allowed to go out. The heat is intense, the smoke thick despite the vents designed to carry it away. Your job is to tend the fire, to keep it burning bright, to adjust the mirror to focus the light where it needs to go. At night you would feel the building sway slightly in strong winds, stone groaning, the fire roaring at your back, casting wild shadows on the walls. You would look out over the dark water, seeing only what your own light revealed, knowing that out there, invisible in the blackness, sailors were steering by your beacon, trusting it to keep them from the rocks that lay hidden beneath the waves. The lighthouse was more than a navigational aid. It was a symbol of Alexandria itself, an announcement that this city was the gateway to Egypt, the meeting place of civilizations, the point where East met West. Its image appeared on coins minted in Alexandria, on mosaics decorating the floors of wealthy homes, in paintings and descriptions that spread across the ancient world. Travelers wrote home about it, describing this impossible tower rising from the sea. It became one of the 7 wonders, spoken of with the same awe as the Colossus of Rhodes or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus. For over 1,000 years, it would stand, surviving wars and storms, and the slow erosion of salt air, a constant presence watching over the harbor. Generations of lighthouse keepers were born, lived and died within its walls. The mirror was replaced many times as the bronze wore out. The statue on top was struck by lightning and rebuilt. The lighthouse adapted and endured, until finally, in the medieval period, a series of earthquakes would bring it crashing into the sea. The first major damage came in 956 AD, then more in 1303 and 1323, each quake weakening the structure until it finally collapsed. In the 15th century, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay built a fortress on its ruins, using the ancient stones, some still visible today in the fortress walls. That fortress still stands, but the lighthouse is gone, its blocks scattered across the harbor floor, discovered only recently by underwater archaeologists who found massive carved stones and fragments of statues in the shallow water, ghosts of that ancient marvel. Alexandria was not simply a Greek city transplanted to Egyptian soil. It was something entirely new, a cosmopolitan metropolis where cultures collided, blended, influenced each other, and sometimes violently clashed. The city was divided into distinct quarters, each with its own character, its own language, its own customs. The Greek Quarter, where the library and palace stood, was the heart of power and learning. Its streets were lined with gymnasia, where young men exercised and studied rhetoric, theaters where plays by Sophocles and Euripides were performed, temples to Zeus and Apollo and Dionysus. Greek was the language of government and education, and to succeed in Alexandria you needed to speak it fluently. The Egyptian Quarter, to the west, was home to native Egyptians, the descendants of people who had lived along the Nile for 3,000 years. Many worked as laborers, servants, or craftsmen, building the monuments that glorified their Greek rulers. They maintained their own temples, massive structures dedicated to Isis and Osiris and Anubis, where ancient rituals were performed in sacred spaces decorated with hieroglyphs that fewer and fewer people could read. And then there was the Jewish Quarter, called the Delta, occupying a large section of the city, perhaps a third of the total area, stretching from the harbor inland. The Jewish community of Alexandria was enormous, possibly the largest Jewish population outside of Judea itself. Estimates suggest that by the 1st century AD, Jews may have comprised as much as 40% of the city's population. They had their own synagogues, elaborate buildings that served as places of worship, study, and community gathering. They had their own courts, allowed to judge disputes according to Jewish law rather than Greek or Egyptian custom. They had their own leaders, ethnarchs who represented the community to the royal government. Many spoke Greek rather than Hebrew or Aramaic as their first language, and they participated fully in the intellectual life of the city. Some Jews studied philosophy at the Mouseion, blending Jewish theological ideas with Greek philosophical concepts. The most famous was Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century AD and wrote extensively attempting to reconcile Jewish scripture with Platonic philosophy, arguing that the stories in the Torah could be read as allegories expressing eternal philosophical truths. It was in Alexandria that the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek, a momentous event in religious history. The version is known as the Septuagint, meaning 70. After the legend that Ptolemy II commissioned 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, to translate the Torah. According to the legend, these scholars worked independently, each in their own cell, and when they finished, all 72 translations were identical, word for word, proof of divine inspiration. The real history was probably less miraculous, but the translation was genuinely important. It allowed Greek-speaking Jews to read their own scriptures, and it would later allow the early Christians, most of whom spoke Greek rather than Hebrew, to read the Jewish Bible. The Septuagint became the standard Bible of early Christianity, and many verses in the New Testament quote the Old Testament using the Septuagint translation rather than the original Hebrew. Relations between the different communities were complex and often tense. The Greeks, as rulers and elites, looked down on the Egyptians as conquered subjects, dismissing their religion as primitive superstition, their gods as animal-headed monsters. They mocked the Egyptian practice of mummification, finding it barbaric and absurd. The Egyptians resented Greek arrogance and the fact that foreigners occupied the throne of the pharaohs. They remembered when their own kings had ruled one of the world's great civilizations, when Egyptian culture and learning had been respected from Ethiopia to Syria. The Jewish community caught between, sometimes allied with Greeks through language and education, sometimes with Egyptians through shared resentment of Greek dominance, depending on political circumstances and economic interests. There were periods of relative peace, when the different groups coexisted, traded with each other, and occasionally intermarried, creating hybrid families that embodied the cosmopolitan character of the city. And there were periods of horrific violence, riots and pogroms where Greek or Egyptian mobs attacked Jewish neighborhoods, burning homes and killing hundreds, while Roman governors looked the other way or actively encouraged the violence. The marketplace of Alexandria, the great agora near the harbor, was where these worlds intersected most visibly and dramatically. Here you could hear a dozen languages spoken simultaneously. Greek merchants haggled with Egyptian farmers over grain prices, arguing in a mixture of Greek and Egyptian. Jewish traders displayed fine textiles from Judea, purple-dyed fabrics that commanded premium prices. Ships arrived from Rome bringing amphorae of wine and olive oil, the staples of Mediterranean diet. Ships from India brought spices, pepper and cinnamon and cardamom, worth more than their weight in silver. From the African interior came ivory and exotic animals, destined for the zoo at the Mouseion or for arenas in Rome. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of fish from the morning catch, sweat from laborers hauling crates, spice from open sacks, perfume from cosmetic vendors, animal dung from the beasts being driven to market, and cooking food from vendors selling street meals. The noise was constant, a roar of voices, the braying of donkeys, the creak of carts, the splash of ships being loaded and unloaded, the cries of seabirds overhead. This was the engine of Alexandria's wealth, the place where goods from 3 continents changed hands, where fortunes were made and lost. Religion in Alexandria was equally complex, reflecting the city's diverse population and its position at the crossroads of civilizations. The Ptolemies, as Greek rulers of Egypt, faced a fundamental problem of legitimacy from the moment they took power. They needed to appear as proper pharaohs to the Egyptian population, legitimate heirs of the ancient dynasties, while maintaining their identity as Greeks to their Greek subjects and to the other Hellenistic kingdoms that might challenge their rule. Their solution was syncretism, the deliberate blending of religious traditions to create something new that could appeal to different groups. They promoted the worship of Serapis, a god who had not existed before the Ptolemaic period. Serapis combined elements of Greek Zeus with his kingly authority, Egyptian Osiris, god of the underworld and resurrection, and Apis, the sacred bull worshipped at Memphis. The name itself is probably a contraction of Osiris Apis. Serapis was depicted in Greek style, as a bearded man wearing a grain measure on his head, symbolizing abundance and royal power. To Egyptians, he could be understood as a form of their traditional gods, a familiar presence in new guise. To Greeks, he was acceptably Hellenic, looking like Zeus, associated with Greek ideas about divine kingship and the afterlife. The Ptolemies built the magnificent Serapeum to house the cult, a massive temple complex that became one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The temple was built on a natural hill in the southwestern part of the city, approached by 100 steps that gave the building a commanding presence. Inside was a colossal statue of Serapiox, 40 feet tall, made of wood and precious materials, its surface gleaming with gold and jewels. The statue was said to have been designed with magnets embedded in the ceiling, so that the god appeared to float in mid-air, a miraculous effect that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The Serapeum also housed a branch of the Great Library, overflow storage for scrolls that could not fit in the main complex, making it both a religious center and a temple of learning. The strategy of syncretism worked, more or less, creating a shared religious center that both communities could embrace, a place where Greek and Egyptian traditions met. But traditional Egyptian religion continued in its own temples, ancient structures that predated the Ptolemies by thousands of years. Priests still performed ancient rituals, speaking formulae in the Egyptian language, writing in hieroglyphs that fewer and fewer people could read as Greek became dominant. They maintained traditions of animal worship that Greeks found bizarre, the sacred cats of Bastet, the sacred bulls of Apis, the sacred crocodiles of Sobek. These practices ensured that Egyptian religion, while tolerated, was seen by the Greek elite as exotic and primitive, the superstitions of a conquered people. The Greek philosophical schools, meanwhile, argued about the nature of the divine, some believing in the traditional Olympian gods, others moving toward monotheism or abstract concepts of a single supreme being, a rational principle underlying the cosmos. And the Jewish community maintained strict monotheism, refusing to acknowledge any god but Yahweh, refusing to participate in the civic religious festivals that honored the Greek and Egyptian gods, creating friction with authorities who saw such refusal as antisocial behavior or even treason. This complex religious landscape, this tangled web of competing beliefs and practices would eventually explode into violence when a new religion arrived, one that claimed to possess absolute truth and demanded exclusive devotion. But that comes later in our story. For now, in the early centuries of Alexandria's existence, the city remained a place of uneasy but mostly functional pluralism, where different peoples and gods coexisted within the same walls, where religious tolerance was maintained not out of principle but out of pragmatism, because the economic benefits of trade and the political benefits of stability outweighed the sectarian passions that would eventually consume the city. Among all the scholars who walked the colonnades of the Mouseion, few names shine as brightly across the centuries as that of a mathematician who worked there in the 3rd century BC. His name was Euclid, and though we know almost nothing about his life, his work would become the foundation of mathematical thinking for over 2,000 years. Euclid's great achievement was not discovering new mathematics, though he did some of that, but organizing existing mathematical knowledge into a single coherent system. His work, known simply as the Elements, began with a handful of simple axioms, self-evident truths, like a straight line can be drawn between any 2 points or all right angles are equal to one another. From these basic starting points, using nothing but logic, he built up, step by step, the entire edifice of plane and solid geometry. He proved that the angles of a triangle always sum to 180 degrees. He proved the Pythagorean theorem, that in a right triangle the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. He explored the properties of circles, polygons, ratios, and proportions. He moved from plane geometry to solid geometry, investigating spheres, cylinders, cones, and pyramids. The Elements was not merely a textbook, though it served that purpose admirably. It was a demonstration of how reason itself works, how certain knowledge could be derived from first principles through pure logic, without appealing to authority or observation. It became the model for all rigorous thinking, influencing not just mathematics but philosophy, science, and theology. When medieval scholars wanted to prove theological doctrines, they often structured their arguments like Euclidean proofs, starting from axioms and proceeding through logical steps to a conclusion. When Isaac Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica in the 17th century, laying out the laws of motion and universal gravitation, he deliberately structured it as a geometric proof in Euclid's style. The book was copied, translated into Arabic, translated into Latin, studied and taught continuously for over 2 millennia. Until the late 19th century, nearly every educated person in the Western world had studied Euclidean geometry. Abraham Lincoln taught himself Euclid to sharpen his legal reasoning. Einstein studied Euclid as a child, and later said it had shown him that it was possible to achieve certain knowledge through reason alone. The Elements influenced how humans think about proof, about certainty, about the power of logical reasoning. Its influence on human thought is almost impossible to overstate. Another figure who would become legendary was Hypatia of Alexandria, though she lived much later, in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, near the very end of classical Alexandria's existence, when the old world was dying and a new one being born in blood and fire. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, himself a mathematician and astronomer, who worked at the Mouseion, one of the last scholars to maintain the institution's traditions as it declined. She was raised in an environment of learning, taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy from childhood. In an age when most women were excluded from formal education, expected to marry young and devote themselves to managing households and raising children, Hypatia became one of the most respected intellectuals of her time, a woman whose brilliance commanded respect even in a deeply patriarchal society. She taught Neoplatonist philosophy, a school of thought founded by Plotinus that attempted to reconcile Plato's ideas with religious mysticism, arguing for the existence of a supreme transcendent one from which all reality emanated. Students came from across the Mediterranean to hear her lectures, sitting in the lecture halls that had once been filled with the greatest minds of the ancient world. She was known for her brilliance, her eloquence, and her virtue. Ancient sources describe her as beautiful but completely uninterested in romance or marriage, dedicated entirely to her studies, wearing the philosopher's rough cloak, deliberately adopting masculine dress and manner to be taken seriously as an intellectual. She wrote commentaries on the works of earlier mathematicians, including a commentary on Apollonius's conics, a complex treatise on the geometry of curved shapes like parabolas, ellipses, and hyperbolas. These commentaries are lost, destroyed when the library burned, but they were used by later mathematicians who praised their clarity and insight. She also wrote a commentary on Diophantus, an earlier mathematician who had worked on what we would now call algebra, solving equations with multiple unknown variables. And she built astronomical instruments, including an astrolabe for measuring the positions of stars and a device for distilling water, practical inventions that showed her interests extended beyond pure theory to the physical world. But Hypatia's story ends in tragedy, a tragedy that reflects the violent religious conflicts that were tearing Alexandria apart, transforming it from a cosmopolitan center of learning into a battleground of religious factions. By her time, the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD, Christianity had conquered the Roman Empire. What had begun as a small persecuted sect had become the state religion, backed by imperial power. The old pagan religions were being actively suppressed, their temples closed by imperial decree or converted into churches, their followers pressured to convert, their priests scattered or killed. In Alexandria, this transition was particularly brutal and chaotic. The Christian bishop Theophilus and later his nephew Cyril led campaigns to destroy pagan temples and drive out pagan worship. The magnificent Serapeum, with its library and its floating statue of Serapis, was stormed by a Christian mob in 391 AD. The statue was smashed to pieces, proving to the crowd that the pagan gods were powerless. The library's scrolls, thousands of them, were scattered, burned or destroyed. The temple itself was demolished, its stones carted away to build churches. Hypatia, as a prominent pagan intellectual, a woman who taught philosophy and refused to convert to Christianity, became a target. She became a symbol, to Christians of the old pagan world that refused to die, and to pagans of the intellectual tradition that was being destroyed. In March of 415 AD, during Lent, she was traveling through the city in her chariot when she was attacked by a mob of Christian monks and laymen led by a reader named Peter. They dragged her from the chariot, stripped her naked to humiliate her, and pulled her into a church, perhaps the Caesareum. There they murdered her brutally. Some sources say they used broken pottery, sharp fragments of roof tiles called ostraca, to scrape the flesh from her bones while she was still alive. Her body was dismembered and the pieces burned, ensuring no pagan shrine could be created at her grave. The killers were never punished. Bishop Cyril, though he later claimed to have had no knowledge of the murder in advance, had certainly created the atmosphere of religious hatred that made it possible. Some early Christian writers tried to justify the killing, claiming Hypatia had been a witch who used her philosophy to lead Christians away from their faith, or that she had been involved in politics supporting the Roman prefect Orestes against the bishop's power. The murder of Hypatia shocked many contemporaries, even among Christians. She was not a political leader or a threat to anyone, simply a respected teacher, a philosopher who had committed no crime except maintaining her beliefs. Her death marked a turning point, a moment when it became clear that the old intellectual culture of Alexandria, the culture of open inquiry and diverse belief, the spirit that had animated the Mouseion for 6 centuries, was dying. The Mouseion itself had likely closed by this time. Its royal funding ended when Rome took direct control of Egypt, its buildings converted to other uses, its scholars scattered or dead. The great age of Alexandrian science and philosophy was over, killed not by barbarian invasion or natural disaster, but by religious intolerance, by the triumph of faith over reason, revelation over inquiry. The decline of Alexandria did not happen all at once, in a single catastrophic moment. It was a slow erosion, taking place over centuries, punctuated by moments of catastrophe that accelerated the decay. One of the first disasters occurred during the Roman Civil War, in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, pursuing his rival Pompey. Caesar had defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, and Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, hoping the Ptolemaic court would shelter him out of gratitude for past support. But the young Ptolemy XXX, or rather his advisors, calculated that Caesar was the future and Pompey the past. They murdered Pompey as he came ashore, presenting his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, far from being pleased, was disgusted by the dishonorable murder of a fellow Roman, even an enemy. He installed himself in the royal palace, occupying it with his legions, and began interfering in Egyptian politics. He backed Cleopatra, Ptolemy's older sister and co-ruler, with whom he began a famous affair, in her power struggle against her brother. The Egyptians, resenting Roman interference and the occupation of their capital, besieged Caesar in the palace quarter. To escape, to break the siege, Caesar ordered his ships to set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, depriving his enemies of their naval power. The fire spread beyond the ships, consuming warehouses and buildings near the waterfront. Ancient sources are unclear and contradictory about whether the library itself burned in this fire. Some claim that the main library, located in the royal quarter but set back from the harbor, was far enough away to escape damage. But they note that warehouses containing scrolls, perhaps 40,000 of them waiting to be catalogued and added to the collection, were destroyed. Others suggest the fire reached the library proper, or at least damaged part of the complex. Modern scholars debate endlessly about the extent of the damage, examining every ancient text for clues, trying to reconstruct what happened on those chaotic days. Most agree that whatever burned, it was not the complete destruction of the library. The institution continued to function for centuries after Caesar's fire. Ancient sources continue to mention scholars working there, scrolls being consulted, the library operating as it had before. But it was a wound, a loss of irreplaceable texts, and a warning of what could happen when politics and war intruded on the world of knowledge. The true destruction of the library happened not in a single fire, but across centuries, through neglect, through changing priorities, through religious conflict and the slow collapse of the institutions that had supported it. The Roman emperors who succeeded the Ptolemies, ruling Egypt as a province rather than an independent kingdom, were less interested in sponsoring scholarship. The library had been a Ptolemaic project, a statement of royal prestige and commitment to learning. The Romans saw it differently, as an expensive luxury, a drain on resources that could be better used elsewhere. Funding declined. Positions went unfilled when scholars died or retired. Fewer scholars came to study, finding better opportunities elsewhere. The library gradually shrank, not through dramatic destruction, but through abandonment. Scrolls that were damaged by time or insects or moisture were not replaced. Sections of the building were converted to other uses, storage or offices or housing. By the time of Hypatia, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, it is unclear whether the Great Library still existed in any meaningful sense, whether there was still a functioning institution or just a dwindling collection in deteriorating buildings. The final blow came with the religious transformation of the empire. When Christianity became the state religion under Constantine in the early 4th century, and especially when Theodosius banned pagan worship entirely in 391 AD, pagan institutions were systematically targeted. The great pagan temples were closed by law, their property confiscated, their priests forbidden to practice their rites. The Mouseion, with its dedication to the Muses, its association with pagan philosophy and learning, became suspect. Christian authorities saw it as a center of dangerous ideas, a place where pagan philosophy was taught, where young Christians might be corrupted. Whether it was officially closed by decree or simply died from lack of support and active hostility, the result was the same. By the 5th century AD, the Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of ancient knowledge, was gone. Later legends, written centuries afterward, would claim that Muslim invaders destroyed the library when they conquered Egypt in 641 AD under the general Amr ibn al-As. According to this story, Amr asked the Caliph Omar what to do with the books he found in Alexandria. Amr supposedly replied that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, because the Quran already contained that knowledge, and if they disagreed with the Quran, they were heretical and dangerous, so in either case they should be destroyed. The books were supposedly burned to heat the city's bathhouses, with so many scrolls that they burned for 6 months. This story is almost certainly false, invented centuries later by Christian writers hostile to Islam, attempting to blame Muslims for the destruction of knowledge. By the time the Arabs arrived in 641, the library had been gone for 200 years or more. There was nothing left to burn. The story persists because it is dramatic and fits prejudices about Muslim barbarians destroying classical civilization, but it has no basis in contemporary sources. The real story is less dramatic, but more tragic. The library was not destroyed by enemies. It simply faded away, neglected and forgotten, as the civilization that had created it transformed into something else. What was lost? This question haunts us still. We know the titles of some works that existed only in Alexandria and are now gone forever, known only from references in other texts. We have references, quotations, brief summaries preserved in later writings. We know that many plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, plays that were famous in the ancient world, performed in theatres across the Greek-speaking world, no longer exist. We have 7 complete plays by Sophocles out of the 120 he wrote. Where are the other 113? Gone lost when the library faded, perhaps surviving in a single copy that was eventually destroyed or simply rotted away. We know that Aristarchus of Samos proposed the heliocentric model, that the Earth revolves around the Sun. His book explaining this revolutionary idea is lost. We cannot read his arguments, cannot see how close he came to anticipating Copernicus by 18 centuries, cannot know what other insights he might have had. We know that the library contained Egyptian texts, histories and religious works written in hieroglyphics or demotic script, the records of 3,000 years of civilization. When knowledge of these scripts was lost, in the early Christian period when Greek and then Latin became dominant and the old Egyptian languages were forgotten, these texts became unreadable. Even if physical copies survived, buried in the sands or reused as wrapping material for mummies, no one could understand them until the 19th century, when Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone and unlocked the ancient language. Centuries of Egyptian wisdom, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, historical records, religious philosophy, lost not because the papyrus burned but because the knowledge of how to read it vanished, the chain of transmission broken. The same is true for countless other works. Scientific treatises that described observations and experiments we can never repeat. Mathematical proofs that solve problems we must now solve again from scratch. Geographical descriptions of the ancient world that would tell us how people understood their place in the cosmos. Historical accounts of events we know happened, but can now barely document. Poems that moved ancient audiences to tears or laughter. Philosophical arguments that challenged conventional thinking. Some estimate that 90% of classical literature has been lost. We have what survived, often by accident, copied by medieval monks who chose to preserve certain texts, usually religious or moral works, while ignoring others they deemed unimportant or dangerous. We have what the Arabs translated and preserved during their golden age of science, when Baghdad and Cordoba became centers of learning and Arabic-speaking scholars translated Greek texts that might otherwise have vanished. We have what was remembered in quotations and references, fragments embedded in works that did survive. But the vast ocean of ancient knowledge has drained away, and we are left with puddles, precious but insufficient. Modern Alexandria shows almost no trace of its ancient glory. The city was rebuilt many times, most recently in the 19th and 20th centuries, when it expanded massively to become Egypt's second largest city and chief port. Ancient structures were quarried for stone, their marble and granite blocks too valuable to leave buried. New buildings were constructed on top of old foundations, layer upon layer of urban development burying the past. The Mediterranean Sea has risen since ancient times, and much of the ancient harbor district is now underwater, visible only to divers. The Pharos Lighthouse collapsed in a series of earthquakes, the first major damage in 956 AD, then more destructive quakes in 1303 and 1323, each one weakening the ancient structure until large sections fell into the sea. In the 15th century, 1477 AD, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay built a fortress on the ruins, using the ancient stones, some of which can still be seen in the fortress walls, massive blocks carved with ancient inscriptions. That fortress still stands, serving now as a naval museum, but the lighthouse is gone, its blocks scattered across the harbor floor. In the 1990s, underwater archaeologists led by Jean-Yves Empereur discovered massive carved stones, fragments of statues, sphinxes, and columns lying in the shallow water near the fortress, ghosts of that ancient marvel. The main library itself, its exact location remains uncertain. Archaeologists have theories based on ancient descriptions and modern excavations, but no definitive evidence has been found. The royal quarter was built over long ago. Its buildings demolished and the land reused many times. Polish archaeologists in the 1990s discovered what might have been lecture halls connected to the Mouseion, ancient structures with tiered seating where students could have listened to philosophers and mathematicians. But the great storage chambers, the endless shelves of scrolls that held the collected wisdom of the ancient world, remain lost. Perhaps they are still there, buried 15 or 20 feet underground, beneath modern buildings and streets, waiting for excavation. Perhaps they were so thoroughly destroyed, stone-robbed and reused, that nothing remains but rubble mixed into the general debris of 2 millennia. Without major excavation disturbing the modern city, we may never know. In 2002, Egypt opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a new library built near the presumed site of the ancient one, facing the harbor where the pharaohs once stood. It was an ambitious project, funded by the Egyptian government with support from UNESCO and donations from around the world, a deliberate attempt to resurrect Alexandria's legacy as a center of learning. The building is striking and modern, a massive cylinder of glass and concrete, its walls engraved with letters from every writing system humanity has created. It can hold millions of books in its climate-controlled stacks. It has research centers, museums, a planetarium, special collections focused on Mediterranean culture and Arab history. It is a beautiful and worthy gesture, a way of honoring what was lost, of asserting that Alexandria will once again be a city of knowledge. But it cannot replace what vanished. No modern library, no matter how large, can hold what Alexandria held, the unique accumulation of ancient knowledge, the irreplaceable texts that exist now nowhere on earth, that no one will ever read again. And yet something survived. Something more important than buildings or scrolls. The legacy of Alexandria lives not in physical structures but in ideas, in methods, in the spirit of inquiry that animated the Mouseion. The concept of the library itself, the belief that knowledge should be gathered systematically, organized rationally, preserved carefully, and made available to scholars. This revolutionary idea came from Alexandria and spread across the world. The method of scholarship developed there. The careful comparison of texts to establish authentic versions, the critical approach to sources, the systematic organization of knowledge by subject and author. These methods became the foundation of how we still conduct research today. The scientific method, the belief that nature can be understood through careful observation and logical reasoning rather than through authority or revelation, was practiced and taught in Alexandria. When medieval scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba, and eventually Paris and Oxford began their own intellectual revolution, they built on foundations laid in Alexandria, using translations of Greek texts that had passed through Alexandrian hands, following methods developed by Alexandrian scholars. Many ancient texts that would have been lost entirely were preserved because they had been translated from Greek into Arabic by scholars in the Islamic world who valued ancient learning, who saw themselves as heirs to the Greek philosophical and scientific tradition. When these Arabic translations were later translated into Latin in medieval Spain and Sicily, they brought Greek knowledge back to Christian Europe, which had largely forgotten it. This chain of preservation, Greek to Arabic to Latin, often depended on copies that had been made in Alexandria, on versions that had been collected and corrected by Alexandrian scholars. In this sense, the library's influence continued long after the building itself had vanished, its methods and its contents preserved through translation and transmission. The story of Alexandria is ultimately a story about fragility. Knowledge seems permanent, written in books, encoded in language, passed down through generations, but it is not. It depends on fragile materials that decay, papyrus that rots, parchment that burns, paper that yellows and crumbles. It depends on institutions that can crumble when their funding ends or when new rulers decide scholarship is unimportant. It depends on languages that can be forgotten, on scripts that become undecipherable when the last person who can read them dies. It depends on cultures that can be destroyed, on civilizations that collapse, taking their accumulated wisdom with them. A single fire can erase centuries of thought. A shift in religious or political priorities can end the work of generations. What survives is often what is useful to the powerful, what serves their interests, what happens by chance to be copied one more time before the last copy decays. The scholars of Alexandria understood this profound fragility. That is why they were so obsessive about collecting, sending agents across the known world to purchase texts, confiscating books from ships, paying enormous sums for rare manuscripts. That is why they were so meticulous about copying, maintaining workshops where trained scribes reproduced texts carefully, comparing copies to catch errors. That is why they were so careful about preservation, building storage facilities with controlled temperature and humidity, protecting scrolls from decay and fire. They knew that they were fighting against time, against entropy, against the constant human tendency toward destruction and forgetting. For a few centuries they won that fight. creating a repository of knowledge unprecedented in human history, a place where the wisdom of ages was gathered and protected. And then, slowly, through a combination of accident, neglect, political change, religious conflict, and simple indifference, that repository was lost. We can still feel the absence of what burned. Every time a historian writes, the work is lost, or only fragments survive. Every time a reference in an ancient text cannot be followed because the book it refers to no longer exists anywhere on earth. We are feeling the empty space where Alexandria once stood. It is like an amputation, a part of human memory cut away. We know it was there because we can see the scar, the references and quotations in works that did survive. But we cannot recover what was severed, cannot reconstruct what was destroyed. Standing in modern Alexandria today, on the Corniche, overlooking the harbor, watching the waves lap against the seawall, you can look out at the water and try to imagine it. Close your eyes and let 2,000 years fall away. The Pharos rising behind you, impossibly tall, its bronze mirror catching the sun, its fire visible for miles. The harbor filled with ships from every nation, triremes from Greece, grain ships from Rome, merchant vessels from India, bringing spices, their sails a forest of canvas. The marble buildings of the royal quarter, gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun, so bright they hurt to look at. The streets filled with people speaking a dozen languages, Greeks in white togas, Egyptians in linen kilts, Jews in colorful robes, all buying and selling, arguing and laughing, going about their daily lives in the greatest city of their world. And there, set back from the harbor, rising behind its garden walls, the Mouseion. The quiet reading rooms where men sat with scrolls unrolled before them, their fingers tracing along lines of text, their lips moving silently as they read. The copying rooms where scribes bent over their work, reed pens scratching endlessly, preserving knowledge, letter by letter, word by word. The laboratories where physicians dissected bodies, where astronomers calculated the movement of planets, where mathematicians proved theorems. The gardens where philosophers walked beneath the shade of trees, arguing about the nature of reality, the existence of the gods, the best way to live a human life. The lecture halls where teachers stood before students, explaining the geometry of Euclid, the philosophy of Plato, the medicine of Hippocrates. All of it gone now, sunk beneath the waves or buried beneath the modern city, destroyed by fire or decay, or simple neglect. But close your eyes, and you can almost hear it. The scratch of reed pen on papyrus, that soft, persistent sound that filled the copying rooms. The rustle of scrolls being unrolled, their tied cords loosened, revealing the text within. The voice of a teacher explaining a proof to students, chalk scraping on a board, diagrams being drawn. The splash of water in fountains in the gardens, the call of birds in the trees, the sound of a great bronze mirror being polished atop the lighthouse, cloth on metal, preparing the mirror to focus its light across the dark water. The call of seabirds over the harbor, circling the ships that brought the world to Alexandria. The murmur of a city that believed knowledge was sacred, that built temples to preserve it, that understood that in the fragility of papyrus and ink was contained something precious and irreplaceable. That city is gone. We will never get it back. The scrolls have turned to dust. The buildings are rubble. The scholars are 2,000 years dead. But we remember it. We mourn it. And we continue the work they began, gathering knowledge, organizing it, preserving it, passing it forward to the next generation, hoping that what we build will not burn, knowing that someday, inevitably, it will. That is the lesson of Alexandria. Not that knowledge is eternal, that civilizations last forever, that progress is inevitable, but rather that knowledge must be actively protected, each generation anew, against the forces that would destroy it, against fire and decay, against political indifference and religious intolerance, against the simple human tendency to forget, to lose interest, to decide that the past doesn't matter. The library burned, slowly, across centuries, but the idea of the library, the dream that inspired it, the belief that human knowledge matters and deserves to be preserved, that idea remains alive, as long as we continue to read, to write, to study, to question, to preserve. We are the heirs of Alexandria. We carry forward the work that began in that impossible city built on the edge of Africa, where for a few bright centuries, humanity gathered its wisdom and dreamed it would last forever. And so our journey through the ancient city comes to an end. We have walked its streets at dawn, entered its library, and felt the weight of scrolls in our hands, climbed the lighthouse and looked out over the darkening sea, stood in the marketplace amid the noise and the smells, watched scholars debate in marble courtyards. We have met Eratosthenes calculating the size of the earth, Euclid proving his theorems, Herophilus opening human bodies to reveal their secrets, Hypatia teaching philosophy in the last days before the darkness fell. We have witnessed the slow decline, the fires and earthquakes, the religious conflicts, the gradual abandonment, the final destruction. The smoke has cleared, the stones have fallen, the scrolls have turned to ash, but the memory endures, carried forward in every library, every university, every place where knowledge is gathered and preserved and passed on. Alexandria reminds us that civilization is fragile, that what seems permanent can vanish, that every book, every idea, every discovery must be actively protected if it is to survive. Thank you for walking with me through this vanished world. May we learn from what was lost and hold more tightly to what remains. May we be better guardians of knowledge than our ancestors were. May we remember that libraries are not mere buildings filled with books, but temples of human achievement, repositories of everything we have learned in our long climb from ignorance toward understanding. Until our next journey into the past, sleep well and dream of marble halls filled with the whisper of ancient wisdom, of scholars bent over their scrolls in pools of lamplight, of the great lighthouse beams sweeping across dark waters, forever seeking, forever guiding, forever remembered.